Let's have a look at the conversation that I saw this morning on Twitter, coming out from the Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Breaking the Human Rights Commission. I don't think that's quite how you're supposed to say it. Breaking news. The Human Rights Commission
that's
has
what the Axe Party wants to do, break.
Okay, that's right. Breaking, the Human Rights Commission has recommended an immediate rent freeze in New Zealand, echoing our call from earlier this year. Choosing between paying exorbitant rent dollars or kai for the whānau, for the family, shouldn't be the reality for many, but it is. Sign our open letter to the PM right now. And then there was a further press release was this morning as well, posted by Marama, that reads, the Green Party backs the Human Rights Commission's call for an immediate rent freeze, followed by reform of the rental system to guarantee that everyone has a warm, dry, affordable place to live. We'll come back to those words in a second. The Human Rights Commission is absolutely right. I guess this is from Marama. An immediate rent freeze followed by permanent and meaningful changes to the way we rent is essential for recognizing the human right to a warm, affordable house, says Marama. A home is a home whether someone rents or owns it, but for 1 in 3 people who rent, the cost of staying in their home is rising much faster than incomes. So that went out this morning. And I would like to, I guess, open the floor for you, Julianne, to first of all, maybe expand on that. Tell us anything else, what this is all about, why this is necessary. The floor is yours.
Well, the government did a rent freeze in 2020. When COVID hit and we went into lockdown, they did a rent freeze, which meant that landlords couldn't put up the rent, basically, for a period of time. And it went beyond the first lockdown. So it's entirely possible to do this. And we are in a situation where there's a massive problem with cost of living going up, and rents are going up faster than inflation, faster than incomes. And that's why it's so great the Human Rights Commission has done this work. It's fantastic to have an independent body doing the work and calling for these sorts of changes. We put out a policy paper in March this year, which was more specific about that we should have an immediate rent freeze, like the government did in 2020. And we do that until 2 things. We can put in place other changes to renting, reforming that system, and while we're increasing the supply of rental housing. So the other 2 things we thought were really important policy tools is a limit on annual rent increases. And so that basically is saying, if you're going to put up a rent, someone's rent in a year, it should be the lower of either the rate of inflation excluding rents or the rate of growth of the median hourly wage, less 1 percentage point. That sounds kind of technical, jargony, but basically there's options for how you set rent increases, and you say landlords aren't allowed to put up the rent more than general inflation is going up, excluding rents, or around the same rate as the growth in median hourly wages, a little bit less. And then the third thing is linking rents to what previous tenants paid, because you want to get rid of that incentive where they might boot out the tenants or the tenants leave and then they massively put up the rent. So these are really practical policies that would help control the growth of rents over time and would link it to what people are paid or what inflation is doing, so that we're sure that we're keeping it reasonable. Sorry, you probably have some questions. I should probably stop there. But I mean, ultimately, there's no reason why government can't do this. There's just no reason. And there are some economists, and I saw Eric Crampton tweeting about this in some survey of economists. Do you think rent controls have improved the supply of affordable housing and affordable rental properties? And most of the economists were saying no. And I mean, I don't need to tell you, this was a very undiverse group of people. I knew a bunch of them that were pointing out, and there was something in kind of general economic theory that was like, rent controls are broken. It's a bad way to manage the issue. You should do it this other way. But I think the evidence and data on that actually in recent years is not as clear, not clear cut. No, I'm not saying it's not the only thing you do. And one of the key things that could be harmful is if you don't have other policies to increase the supply of publicly provided housing and rental housing, then in the absence of anything else, rent controls are really good for the people who are living somewhere when they get the apartments. But then maybe for new people moving into the area over time, it becomes harder and harder to get. And, and then they end up paying a fortune. Like, in some cities, like maybe San Francisco would be an example of a rent control policy that hasn't worked. But that's also because they're so horribly NIMBY in San Francisco that, and you've got the whole problem with, the tech sector just being awash in way too much capital and that driving up prices. But I mean, San Francisco really has not increased supply in the way that many other cities have done, and it should have. And that's because it was, it was sort of like, you can't build anything here. We're freezing the city in a moment in time. So, so practical policy is totally achievable and I think very fair. But ultimately, we do want a much bigger role for the public sector, whether that's local government, iwi, community trust sort of thing, or central government in the supply of public housing. And, you just have to guarantee an affordable place for people to live in the place they want to live. We can do that as a society. I know it's stupid not to.
Yeah. I guess the big question for all of us is, how do you enforce it? I mean, how do you force a landlord not to increase the rent between tenants, or like, how do you stop a private citizen who owns a home who has tenants coming in not to increase the rent? How does that work?
Well, I mean, they were able to do it. I think you've got a tenancy tribunal. I think, I'm not sure. One of the ideas we floated, and I don't know if the government has actually picked this up, but is having a kind of advocacy organization that's publicly funded, that's on hand for renters to be able to take things to tenancy tribunal, and basically just leave it up to the tenants to make complaints. And the landlord has to be able, they have to have records. They have records of what they've been charging for rent. And they have to declare this stuff, obviously when they're paying taxes and things. It's all part of the being a landlord. You sign an agreement with the tenant, and it says what your rent is. And so there is that record. So I don't think it would be that hard to enforce.
I mean, I was just reading a news story today. There's something like 1,000 landlords hadn't lodged the bonds with the tribunal. So, they're already not doing what they're supposed to do. So some governance of that would be quite tricky. But yeah, I mean, for me, the only question I have is that you say until we increase supply and things like that, but that's not going to be for a long time.
Yeah.
Like, you want to freeze the rents until that point? Like, that feels a little unrealistic.
No, I mean, we definitely think there's a case right now because we know there's a gap between supply and demand. And in that time, you don't want rents to just keep skyrocketing. So
but what's the end point?
But initially, actually, in our paper, we just said freeze rents until you've got these other limits in place and the rest of the framework. And you need to ensure that you're continuing to increase the supply. And I would say, government's going as hard as it can on that at the moment, but it's probably not the perfect institutional framework for increasing supply over time. And it's a really difficult time to do it as well. Ideally, we would have had a big publicly funded state home public housing build in the aftermath of the GFC, when all of these builders were going under and we needed economic and fiscal stimulus. That would have been a time. And so, during that time, a lot of things did not get built because National was ideologically opposed to public housing. And by the time they sort of got onto it, it was already starting to pick up again. So when there were policies like Kiwi Build, it really didn't work at a time when the market was already kind of, maxed out. And now we're sort of running into problems because there's all this demand for building, and government is exacerbating that by trying to build a lot of houses really fast. But we have to do it. But counter-cyclical building would be better.
And it's just so tricky too, because I know I am incredibly lucky to be able to own this home, but I have only just done that. So for my whole life, I have rented. And so, a lot of people sort of attack landlords a lot of the time, but we still need them, obviously. And that's the thing, we need so many people to actually be renting from these people. And they've had inflationary pressures and stuff like that as well. So, and that's really big currently for everybody. I really like the idea of tying it to inflation. To me, that makes perfect sense. You know what I mean? Like, that's what we're all facing. That's all the costs we're facing together. To me, that makes perfect sense. And to me, it's good to bring this in after we've had the healthy homes initiatives, etc. Like, they've had deadlines to get to things, spent the money, and that they could make tax deductible those spending the money to make that retrograde the houses, all that sort of stuff. So then from here on in, it's about the linking to inflation, whereas they should be healthy. So I don't know what you've talked about in the past. If you've talked about things that are you not on board with the Healthy Homes Initiative, Pat Brittenden?
No, it's not that at all. I mean, are you talking about what Julianne and I have talked about in the past?
Yes.
I run another thing, which I started off at the end of last year, relaunched, called Elephant TV. And we did a debate, and it was affordable quality housing is a right. I was the moderator, so I was the host. It was my platform. And There was a property investor at one side who was a lovely guy. And I think him and Julianne got on quite well and had some points of agreement in some places. And Julianne coming on to talk on behalf of that, because the affordable quality household is right. That's why I said the phrasing of this. I understand. Not understand necessarily, but I see it in other green policy. So that was what it was more about. But look, I do have a question, and I'm not a landlord, but I think about what others will be thinking and asking. So tomorrow the OCR is due to go up by 50 basis points. Yeah, that means someone who's got $600,000 mortgage is going to be paying an extra $60 a week. How do you? Because I mean, this is actually based on what you said, Penny, about increasing supply. If it became unaffordable for a landlord to own a house, is there any danger in rental freezes that this could do the opposite? If a landlord tomorrow has his mortgage go up by 60, 80, $100 a week, and there's a rental freeze, is the expectation just that person will eat it? Or, I guess I'm wondering when the numbers don't quite look, and there was a story a few weeks ago that says at the moment it's the most expensive in 65 years to get into a house because of the cost of houses and the cost of rates. So I'm wondering about that.
Add to that as well the fact that you can't claim interest anymore. So that's another added expense not on new builds, but on existing building. So that's another expense that's quite new as well. So yes.
So if there is an increase in the landlord's cost, would the expectation just be that they eat it in this, Julianne, or how does that work?
Well, they would be, because the increase would be linked somewhat to inflation, and inflation is somewhat linked to interest rates. There would be that relationship there to some, and I think, ultimately we do want to get away from heavily leveraged landlords that only own one or two properties and who are just, making a loss in order to get the tax-free capital gains later. And of course, unfortunately, all the incentives personally, like for your personal wealth, up until very recently, were buy property, and we need to change that, because it's not good for our society. It's not fair. And so that started to change, and that's why they got rid of the interest deductibility on investment property. We don't have interest deductibility on our homes, so why would you? It doesn't make sense that you're giving that sort of incentive to people to own investment properties. And I think ultimately, there's going to have to be this shift, and maybe what would happen is people would get out of their investment property because they couldn't afford, they really couldn't afford it at that point. But
when you say get out, do you mean the landlords would get out of the investment properties? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and sell.
But then what happens to that tenant who needs the house? Yeah.
What should happen is that then the price of buying homes reduces quite a lot. And so a lot of people are renting who want to buy a home can afford to buy a home. So, the issue with supply and demand is really about just like the number of people who need to live somewhere and the number of homes. And it kind of doesn't, it'll move around because there are people who might want to be long-term renters, but there's a whole lot of people renting because they can't afford to buy. And so if there's people selling rental properties because they can't afford to keep being a landlord, then then the price starts to come down of people buying homes, because there aren't all those people who already had capital, who were the people who owned lots of houses, and it was easier for them to buy another house than the first home buyer.
Right.
So suddenly the market becomes more more homes are available and affordable for first home buyers. So it does work in that sense. Now, the issue that Penny brought up about there will be people who want to rent, and creating a kind of environment that is secure and attractive for long-term renters to make a place a home is something that we absolutely support and want to do. And ultimately, you really want to do that with more like institutional landlords. They are better landlords. They're much more predictably good landlords. If you have good regulation, good regulation and you have a good legal environment for, in other countries, that is much better than you randomly have, someone who owns one or two properties, and they can't really be, some of them are really nice and generous, and some of them are like, I'm going to wait to the last possible minute for complying with the healthy home standard. And no, I'm not going to show up when your shower's broken. And actually you need, it's very hit and miss. And I think you are much better off if you have professional landlords, which may be not for profit, and maybe that would be better. Not for profit, community sector, or government. City councils can be quite good landlords.
Yeah, like my father's had flats the whole time, and he's good. He gives them presents. He does. He gives his tenants Christmas presents, and he put heat pumps in decades ago and all this sort of stuff, which was incredible. Whereas my landlord only put a heat pump in our flat after we had left and he was trying to sell it. He only put insulation in at the last minute. And I was like, it was about a year in advance, because I sent him an email going, are you going to wait until the deadline, because it's freezing in this house? It's fucking freezing, excuse me. So yeah, so he was a bit like that. But I was reading about Germany, because I was looking at some tweets earlier, right? And there's people like, oh, it's failed in Germany, and because Berlin brought in a rent freeze, and it has just been overturned, but that was because the central government decided that the state government didn't have the authority to do that. It wasn't because it's a failed experiment or anything like that. But one of the main people that are driving behind it is there's this huge one, I think it's called Deutsche Wohner, which means live, where people are very unhappy. It's a huge institutional landlord, and they're very unhappy with them and think that they are not great. So, there's always exceptions, and when, because Germany is so about renting. Germany's all about renting.
What about, I mean, I'm not poo-pooing this idea, but what about, it seems like the gap is maybe there's no real harsh penalties at the moment for landlords. They get away with anything. What about beefing up like the tenancy tribunal and what they can do, not having this massive, big, long, drawn out situation that takes 6 months to sort anything out? And like, because what Penny said, we've had this conversation. In fact, we probably had it in that debate. I talked about France as well, and the idea that I said in that debate we had was, it feels to me a bit improbable to think we can fix the housing market because of prices and demand, but it doesn't feel improbable that we can fix the rental market. And looking to places like France or Germany, what they're doing there, and giving people the opportunity to rent for life if they want to, and having some security around there, seems to me like a more achievable outcome for giving people home security, securities in their home, than perhaps hoping that the one or two mums will get out of it, mum and dad, landlords will get out of it, then the prices might drop. And, because if it's a good rental property and the prices are dropping, then what's not to say just all the big owners just won't, pick it up and then buy it off them. We can't force them not to be landlords unless we can, rather than the local body or the central government becoming the landlords. So this seems again to be a conversation floating around. Why don't we just fix up the renting rules and then protect the renters more and give them the out that way? Maybe this is a part of what you're saying, but it feels like there needs to be some teeth there as well for those bad landlords, as well as perhaps some help with the rental.
Definitely want more teeth and actual consequences. And it would be great to get some of those property managers to be regulated, and they're a pretty toxic part of the mix as well, because sometimes you have good, people who would be good landlords, but they've outsourced it to this property management company, which has been, horrific. And often telling them, I had friends who their property management companies were telling them, oh, you don't need to invest in the insulation now. It's not until 2021 or whatever, so don't do it now. And my friend was like, but you've told me it's not up to standard and the people are cold. I want to do it now. I don't want them to be cold over the winter. But lots of people won't have that, I mean, they'll just do what the property management company says, which is, pay as little as possible, wait as long as possible before improving things for your tenants.
Yeah. Whereas I
think Penny might have frozen. I thought Penny was thinking for a second, but no, I think she might have actually frozen. While she's frozen, let me ask you something, Julie. Thank you for coming on and talking to us about this.
Sorry, I keep coughing.
No, look, I hope you guys are okay. I
noticed
Penny had a bit of a cough there.
I know. I don't usually. I'm fine. But
there we go. Penny's back. You're back. Yeah. You froze up for a period of time, but you're back again.
Right.
I won't interrupt your question. You go.
I was just going to say, so the thing that he did that was amazing in that whole time we lived there for 9 years is he put the rent up $40 in 9 years. Oh. So, and that is phenomenal. And it's what he said. I was never greedy. I'm like, no, you weren't, but we were freezing and we would have been happy to pay a little bit more to not be freezing. Like it was, you could see your breath inside and there was just a wood burner, which is fine at night. And the whole place got heated up massively. But at 7 o'clock in the morning, you could see your breath inside. And the bathrooms had louvered windows that didn't close properly. So, and it was a gouger. So that I will give him absolute credit for that. And he was a nice guy.
Was this in Auckland?
Yeah.
Dude, moved to Dunedin. Yeah, I reckon you want to know cold.
Christchurch was freezing. It was so. It was. I just remember that chill in my bones. Yeah.